Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and in this episode of RPG Crawler Reviews, I'm going to take a look at not one, but four products all at once. 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons has enjoyed more success than its prior iteration, and part of that is because of a commitment to quality in terms of the main material released. Rather than coming out with a major release every month like the prior two iterations, Wizards of the Coast has concentrated on producing large adventure books with only a few non-adventure supplements. While this has kept the overall quality high, it has limited, some might say intentionally, the proliferation of monsters, feats, items, and skills that you would normally have seen released in those monthly splat books in prior editions. I'm of the opinion that in some cases, especially in terms of feats, this is actually a very good thing, as it gives slightly less room for players to find ways to exploit the system. A simple system, after all, is slightly less prone to min-maxing. However, in some cases, especially in terms of spells and monsters, this leaves a limited amount of creatures that are ready-made for the DM's arsenal to inflict upon the players. So it leaves a limited number of spells for the DM's spellcasters to go ahead and access, unless said DM wishes to craft entirely new things. And that's perfectly feasible, but with that said, there are a number of third-party sources to which a wily DM might pluck new spells and creatures without having to go through the whole trouble of designing them from scratch. Especially since the DM's Guild opening up, a number of third-party supplements have hit the market, and unfortunately they are of drastically varying qualities. Now, new spell supplements are especially useful for a DM because spells are one thing that a DM can easily limit access to, second really only to monsters. If the DM wants a new spell in the game, it can be placed in an enemy wizard's spellbook on a particular scroll or be cast by an opposing or allied cleric without exposing the entire book it comes from wholesale to the player characters. It puts a bit of mystery back into the magic system as the players come up against things that they really don't know about, and that can help keep players on their toes. So with that in mind, let's take a look at 4 spellbook focused supplements. 3 of them are released on the DM's Guild, one of which predates it. Let's take a look at the Book of Lost Spells first. As stated, it predates the new 5th edition OGL, and was actually compiled under the version released with 3rd edition that has been used so many times for so many third-party materials. It was released in 2015 by Necromancer Games, which was purchased by Frog God Games a few years back. It is available as a PDF for $19.99 US from the Frog God Games website, as well as Tabletop Library, and apparently as a hardcover for $44.99 from the Frog God Games site, or slightly less from Amazon. Now, Necromancer Games was known for producing decent quality old school adventures and supplements for 3rd edition D&D, basically specializing in aiming for a 1st edition AD&D style feel. The Book of Lost Spells follows that tradition by attempting to update some of the old spells or generic versions of older edition spells sometimes when they couldn't actually use the proper spell itself to be more friendly with the 5th edition rules. There are a number of spells which I cannot find any prior edition analogs, however, but they too follow the same sort of feel that one would expect of spells from the olden days. Now, this book is the priciest of all the supplements that we'll cover in this review, but is also by far the largest, and thus I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on it, as it claims to have over 700 spells in it. I think it's 708 something. I think there might be a few duplicates with the core and the subsequently released what's it called? For the Elemental Evil Player's Companion, that's it. I think there might be 1 or 2 duplicates, but not many. And while I haven't counted exactly how many there are, from the general layout, I have no problem believing that there's well over 700 spells in there. The PDF, which I have, is 137 pages, with a cover page, a table of contents that spans a few pages, and a quick intro. It's got a list of spells by class, a wizard spell index by school at the end, and a few pages of legal text at the very end. But the spell entries themselves are very tight and compact, and basically most of the book's devoted to them, of course. They're situated in such a way that allows for several to fit on a page at a time. Scattered throughout the book are black and white illustrations that demonstrate a few of the spells in action. There is a gorgeous cover art, as is typical with Frog God Games release. The illustrations on the interior are in a variety of styles that somewhat mimic the various illustrations from earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, like the Red Box, the AD&D stuff, even on into 2nd edition. The spell descriptions themselves don't follow the standard 5th edition layout exactly, but I kind of prefer the way they did it in some instances, because important information, such as the class who can cast it, the area of effect, and so on and so forth, all the relevant saves, they're all placed in the stat block before the description generally. That gives you an easy lookup for that sort of thing. It's closer to what you'd expect from a 3rd edition book. Now, something that must be said to all who will examine this book, recall that it was done prior to the new 5th edition OGL, and thus some common game terms were not covered under the prior OGL and thus were unusable. Things like advantage are thus called tactical advantage instead in this book. Overall, it's hardly noticeable and doesn't really detract from the spell write-ups themselves, but it is worth noting. Mechanically, most of the spells are well balanced compared to current spells, especially in the player's handbook. However, there are a large number of specialized utility spells that can be difficult to balance against existing spells simply because the functionality doesn't exist within existing spells. For instance, one spell summons a pilot for the sole purpose of piloting any vessel which the characters come across, which is great, except that it's not even a ritual, so the players would have to, number one, understand that they're in need of a pilot for a vessel, and none of them have a skill to use that vessel. Number two, have it memorized at that moment for some reason. The odd situational spell aside, there's a number of spells that duplicate old spell effects and items in these books. Bead of Blasting, for instance, if anyone remembers the magic item Beads of Blasting, basically produces 1 bead of blasting. There are several which are explicitly made to boost undead, either temporarily or permanently, for those necromancers who make heavy use of the animate dead spell from the core rulebook. A few of the spells seem a little overpowered for the level they're set at, but the beauty of something like this is that if you have a supplement with this many spells, you do not have to give your players carte blanche to just take everything from it. You can judiciously allow them spells from within its pages, or you could even reserve some overpowered spells solely for use by your NPC wizards just to even the odds, and then, oh, I'm sorry, it's not in his spell book, or it's not in the spell book that you can find. With 700 plus spells, I could be here literally all day talking about them. So let's just go over a few of the ones that interested me personally. We'll go with Adamantine Bones. I'm really stumbling over spell names today, and that's not good. Although Adamantine Bones has a very high cost material component, basically a pound of adamantite, it can permanently turn an animated skeleton into a tank, basically rendering it immune to non-magical, not adamantine physical attacks. And there's your low-end skeleton suddenly becomes almost invulnerable in melee. Chill of Evil is a high-level cleric spell that can effectively render its victim evil for a week, twisting their actions towards the cruel and merciless without actually just diametrically switching their alignment. It's perhaps a bit unfair, but I could see, as I said, where something like that, you could have the enemy caster use it without necessarily exposing it to the players themselves. And you could use it to really burden a party much more effectively than simply killing one of them. And from the DM's perspective, that might be the more useful option. There is Create Crypt Thing. That's a holdover from 1st and 2nd edition D&D. 2nd edition had it in one of the Monster Manual or Monstrous Compendium supplements. Although that particular spell requires another Frog God Games book, 5th edition Foes, because it literally creates a crypt thing, and they cover it in 5th edition Foes. Devouring Darkness creates an area of effect damage that leaves a lingering, obscured area in its wake. And if the initial damage kills the creatures within it, it reanimates them as shadows, and that is just freaking awesome. Spells like Distance Distortion make a return. There's a high-end cleric and wizard spell that halts aging for a random number of years. And that could be extremely useful for a very long ongoing campaign that goes beyond the basic adventure every single day kind of thing. There are an entire series of shield buff spells that grant bonuses to the wielder of the targeted shield, which seems sort of neat and kind of paladin-y. In fact, many of them are for paladin, although they have a few for cleric as well. There's Inflict Lycanthropy, which was in a prior edition splat book, and that basically permanently afflicts the target with lycanthropy. No alignment returns here, although there are reasons that spells like that were removed from 5th edition, so keep that in mind if you put them back in. Not all the spells are super powerful for their level, of course. Net, for instance, simply conjures a tightening net of seaweed that seeks to ensnare the target, while Otter's Grace just basically grants swimming bonuses to one creature. They even have a modified version of the Summon Undead series from 3rd edition, which I personally liked but thought could use some tweaking, and they did tweak it here. This is one that, while I have the PDF version, I'd really actually almost rather have it in a hard copy as well. It's that classic of a resource. I really think that you can get a lot of mileage out of it. The variety of spells can be helpful for all DMs and some players, while DMs who are looking to convert old adventures might find it contains spells that were not reprinted that'll definitely be useful in doing so. It may not have every olden spell in it by any means. In fact, I know it doesn't because I've got the Wizard Spell Companion from 2nd edition, and that thing is freaking huge. But it does fill in a hell of a lot of the gaps. I kind of wonder whether they'll do an edit of this book to make it compatible with the new OGL, but I think it's almost better how it is now. If you can handle a couple non-standard terms within it, some minor imbalances, then I definitely recommend Book of Lost Spells. The rest of these books are available through the DM's Guild, and I'll put links to all of them in the description below as well. Mostly, they're much smaller in scope than the Book of Lost Spells. They make use of the new OGL, if not the DM Guild license itself, and all of them are primarily available in PDF format. In fact, I'm not even sure any of them are available in printed format. The next book we'll thus look at is called the Necromancer Spellbook by Icy Evil. Available on the DM's Guild, of course, it focuses on spells that are really useful for necromancers and necromancer-style characters, although it's kind of defined rather broadly in this instance. There are spells for Bard, Cleric, Paladin, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard, pretty much everyone but Druid. A lot of these are translations of older edition material to 5th edition rules. Unlike the previous book, there are fewer spells in this one. There's around 40 spells, I think, with a few templates for skeletons and zombie animals at the end, because this book actually brings back Animate Animals, a version of the Animate Dead Animals from the old Complete Necromancer's Handbook. One of my personal favorite low-level spells. Graphically, it uses the standard DM's Guild style templates for 5th edition content, so the fonts, layout, and graphics match the standard 5th edition fare. It's got a pretty nice cover image and fitting interior art that's thematically appropriate, although it doesn't directly illustrate the spells themselves. The spells in this particular book cover all kinds of level of power, from the slightly underpowered to the what the hell side of things. The vast majority of them, however, are well balanced. Some of them are intrinsically more powerful than others, not because of any outward damage that they cause versus similarly leveled spells from the player's handbook, but rather because of the options that they allow. Animate Animals, as I mentioned before, it allows the creation of undead at level 1, albeit just as long as you're willing to put weak ones up there. This is a functionality that usually you had to wait for Animate Dead at a much higher level to do. The most powerful spell in the book is Raise City, which is at 9th level. It consumes an expensive item from that city, and it has to have been a city that was abandoned for more than 50 years, and you basically reanimate the entire settlement. I mean, you may get less skeletons or whatever than would normally be present, but you get a hell of a lot of undead in that one spell, and they're all under your control. This can create an entire army of undead, but the catch is that they can't leave the city. So it's really great for mounting a defense in an ancient abandoned city, but not much for actually going out and doing stuff with. Mostly, though, the spells in this book are utilitarian and filler necromancy spells that a necromancer-style character classically relied upon to provide more than just reanimation and damage to a party. There's things like Ghoul Touch and Hold Undead to help with crowd control. There's Detect Dead, Death Watch, and Sensory Link to provide a certain degree of intelligence gathering. There's Wall of Bone for area control, etc., etc. It really does greatly expand on the Necromancer's capabilities. As of this recording, the normal price for the Necromancer Spellbook is $3.99 US. I think I got it on sale for about half that. Even at $3.99, for those of you who are looking for a spells per dollar value, it loses out to Book of Lost Spells. However, due to the focus which these spells place on necromancy and necromancy alone, for those who are simply looking out to flesh out that all-too-common archetype, whether as a player or as the DM, it's still worth the cost, I believe. Especially if you can find it on sale, just make sure your DM's going to allow third-party spells if you're doing it as a player. I know I would have loved something like this as a regular Necromancer player back in the day, instead of buying the full splat book of a number of other resources back in first and second edition. Next up are two that of this recording are Pay What You Want on the DM's Guild. Pay What You Want is an interesting concept to me simply because it functions as a sort of try before you buy kind of experience. You can effectively decide to pay nothing, and then if you end up using the content a lot, you can go back and pay what you think the author deserves. There are merits to this, and there are a lot of downsides to this in terms of the author, but those go far beyond the scope of what I'm going to go ahead and touch on in this review. However, it does mean that these next two entries are way more accessible to people. If you do end up using these two entries in your game regularly, or any Pay What You Want priced books out there, I encourage you to look to throw at least a little bit of money back to the author if you really enjoy them. If you decide it's worth it if you decide it's worth it after you've already started using it, you can always go back and repurchase the product you initially paid nothing for and just throw a buck or two at them if you believe that they merit it. Always good to keep those authors inspired to make more. First of the two Pay What You Want offerings we'll look at is the Tome of Lost Spells by Ed Robinson. Not to be confused with the Book of Lost Spells we covered earlier, this is a much smaller offering. It covers 22 spells, many of which are classic conversions, scattered among a few classes. As the author states, it's a mix of things meant to flesh out some undersupported specialties, things that the author needed to convert their campaign from 3.5 to 5th edition, and a few old favorites just set aside because. Graphically, it shares the same sort of typeface, page dressing, and layout of the standard 5th edition releases. It's just 8 pages with no cover art and only one generic illustration of some sort of wizard within. Very workmanlike, very to the point, it gets the job done, and it's easy to read. What more can you ask for? It has classics like Explosive Runes, always a good joke, or sometimes a lethal trap. It's got yet another version of Ghoul Touch. I think almost everything but the next one in this particular review has a version of Ghoul Touch in it. It has Summon Swarm, it's got Vision, it's got Wail of the Banshee, and a lot more. There's a good mix of spells, but most of them are wizard spells, with just a few applicable to other classes. The conversions here are actually quite well balanced, although a few are clearly converted from the 3rd edition versions. There's still, at least in the version that I'm covering, a few instances of 3rd edition terminology left behind in the conversions, but the author has apparently been fixing them over time, and that's one of the good things about buying these PDFs, is that the author can effectively patch them and fix any mistakes. All in all, if you're looking for a few choice spells from the old editions and don't want to pay a lot, this is not a bad choice, although the spell selection is inherently limited. The last title we'll address is something a bit different than the prior ones. Yes, it's another spell book, and yes, it's largely full of 5th edition conversions from spells from a previous version, but Spells of Old, Volume 1, by John Crowley III, is focused solely on content from the Lords of Madness, a 3.5 edition supplement focusing on aberrations. I'll admit, right up front, I found the original one had a material that was usable and had some good points, but it was not my favorite book by a long shot, and that will of course color my view about how useful the spells in this particular conversion are. What you will find if you enjoyed that book, or you just enjoy aberrations in general, are 13 spells converted directly over. A few are useful in any general game, such as Blast of Force, which does damage and knocks a target prone at a distance, Dark Bolt, which is again a damaging ray, this time with cold and necrotic damage, and Utter Dark, a vastly improved darkness type spell. There are a fair number of spells that are suitable for use by villains, so a DM may get more mileage out of this one than a player could. Graphically speaking, the Spells of Old is similar to most other generic 5th edition releases in the DM's Guild, as I've stated in the prior book. It's got appropriate page graphic and layout, font use, etc. There are no illustrations here, but the arrangement is quite legible and easy to reference. I did see one or two failures to convert the 3.5 terminology over, but like the Tome of Lost Spells, these seem to be entirely understandable on the fly, and who knows, they may be fixed in a future version. The use of Volume 1 before the Spells of Old title and the short preface on the title page seem to indicate that this should be the first of a series of such conversions, each focusing on a different book, and I hope the author does go forward with that. There are quite a few 3.5 supplements that had some really neat spells, worthy of conversion to 5th edition in my opinion. Overall, I just wish they'd picked a more usable book for the first volume. That's just my input, though. It is, however, pay what you want as of this recording, so that helps offset that concern somewhat. So as you can see, for those wanting to add spells to the basic list presented in the official Wizards of the Coast books, there are a number of options that they're available for all budget ranges. Looking back on what I've covered, I have to say that personally it seems to be very much a you get what you pay for kind of thing with these 4 books. I don't think any of them are bad, but the sheer breadth and the scope of the Book of Lost Spells from Necromancer Games / Frog God Games, that just makes it well worth the price in and of itself, even dealing with the fact that it doesn't use the most recent OGL. I need to get a hardcover version at some point, as it just gives so many options to so many different characters. If I had to stick to a strict budget but still had some money to spend, I would personally get a lot of mileage from the Necromancer spellbook as well, simply because I tend to play a lot of Necromancer characters. However, the existence of the smaller pay-what-you-want supplements is definitely a worthwhile endeavor, and even worth throwing a couple bucks at it if you decide they're worth it. They can be useful not only to flesh out a player's spellbook, but to provide some challenging surprises to PCs who have the system down and memorized. I hope that we'll see more of these smaller supplements, although I could see where someone who uses these third-party entries may have to designate which book they could take them from, because there might be easily 4 or 5 different versions of some of the more popular old spells out there. At any rate, I hope you found this overview and review at least a little informative. I will put links on where you can get all of these books in the description below. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to hit that like button, leave a comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.